Alright guys, in this video I'm going to be teaching you how to make a jig for any lock, any mortise lock, anything you'll ever install to do with hardware that needs to be cut accurately onto the door, and it makes it super quick and easy to do. So let's get into it. So I've got a long board. You can use any MDF skirting or whatever you have around. Better to use MDF as the surface is smoother and it's just I prefer to work with it. You mark a center line on the board, and then you will take your mortise lock or lock. I'll just use mortise lock, and you screw it to the board itself, and you have to make sure it's centered, completely centered to the millimeter, because every mistake you'll do here will transfer onto the door. So basically, you can see here I'm screwing the mortise lock onto the center of the board. I will double check that it's perfectly centered, and as I said, to the millimeter. Make sure it's to the millimeter. If you're already going to the effort of making a jig, you might as well do it right. So yeah, as you see, I'm rejigging it a little bit, so because it was a mil off, and now you can see I'm checking again. Anyway, in a minute you'll see we'll cut some straight pieces to screw around the faceplate of our mortise lock. If you have a mortise lock with a removable faceplate, you can just do the whole process just with the faceplate. You don't have to do what I'm doing here using the whole lock. That lock cannot be separated from its faceplate. Alright, so you can see me right there marking our line along the mortise lock, and there is another piece of MDF I'm going to be using now. You just see me cutting it into long strips. Alright, so you see now I'm pretty much screwing those strips very tightly to the mortise lock itself. I will drill some pilot holes as it's MDF and I don't want it to split. Now, once we've got those holes drilled, I will screw those strips down, and we'll do the same thing on the other side. It's very important to countersink your screw holes, as you're going to be cutting with a router over it, and you don't want the router to grab onto the screw, so you want to have a smooth surface. That's why you can see me countersinking it, so the screw is actually below the surface. Alright, now I'm checking that we're on the lines and we didn't do any mistakes, that we're to the millimeter. Again, we can't make any mistakes here because every mistake will be transferred onto the door to every lock that we'll ever install with that jig. It will be exactly the same. That's why we need to really make sure that we are straight, tight, everywhere to the lock itself. Now I'm going to be cutting the top pieces. As you see, I just cut the top pieces and I'm installing them. Again, the same thing, as tight as possible to the faceplate, to the mortise lock. Now the next step will be unscrewing the mortise lock itself from the board while everything else stays. So we're left with a shape of that mortise lock around the board, on the board. Next thing, we'll drill a hole right in the middle for our router bit to go through. You'll have to use a router bit that has a little wheel up top, which in most places it's called pattern following bit or jig bit or any one of those, I can add a link in the description below. You'll feed that onto your router and use that to cut out the shape that you just created on the skirting board, on the board that you have. And that will pretty much give you a that will give you the shape of that lock on the board that you started with. You'll see that in a minute. Alright, so now that we have the hole in the middle, we're putting our router through, and basically you don't want to do it in one pass. You probably want to do it in a few. So you set it to a lower depth and you do one pass. After you've done one pass, you increase the depth and you just do that all the way until you are through the bottom. Right, so once we finish cutting it all the way through, we're gonna take the router out and we're gonna check if everything is straight, everything is perfect. We didn't somehow touched the sides, or it's a bit wobbly and a bit not straight. We have to really make sure. If there is still a little bit missing, like I had here, you just do another pass with the router and make sure to cut it all off. After you've done that, you will remove the strips of MDF, thin strips that you screwed on from the top, and you will pretty much be left just with the board, with that slot, the shape of your mortise lock in the middle. We can grab the mortise lock and actually check how tight is the fit right there. It's pretty good. You'll see it on the door in a minute. Alright, so after we removed all the bits and strips, we're gonna double check that we're exactly in the center, that we've done everything right and everything is correct. From then on, we will start marking out our centers and the width of the door we need. You could adjust the width of the door you're working with, but I just made that for a 40 mil door, which is a very standard entry door size in Australia. So should fit onto pretty much any door. If the door is slightly smaller, you can always use peckers or something on the sides, so you make the jig sit tighter on the door. So you see me now marking the width of our door from the center, so 20 mil each side, and that will give us the lines of where we should put our side plates of the jig. On the side plates, we're going to mark our cylinder and handle positions to make it easier in the installation. So right now, as you can see, I'm laying down the mortise in the slot it goes, and I mark our center line because that's what we're going to use to line it up onto the door. And then I'm going to mark the center line of the handle positioning, and I'm going to mark the center lines of the cylinder. The cylinder is 2 holes, it's a Euro cylinder, and I'm going to transfer those lines onto the other side of our jig and onto the sides of the jig that we will cut in a second. So yeah, now you can see me marking the square lines across the jig, and that will help us to screw the sides in line on both sides of the doors. You'll see that in a minute. Alright, so right there I'm making the sides of our jig. The sides, we are marking our back set, which in different locks in different countries can be different, but you just mark yours. And we're gonna line it up exactly where we need it to be, because that's how we're gonna determine the position of the cylinder and the position of the handle. So right now you see me marking it on the side, and I'm taking the measurements right from the jig itself, from the measurements I marked before, and we're going to be screwing down those sides onto the main plate, onto the main board, whatever you want to call it. And we're going to be using screws for that, and you have to make sure you really pre-drill it, because it's really easy to split MDF, so you really got to be careful with that. Otherwise you're gonna have to remake the side, at least, anyway. And yes, when you do drill through the top plate, you really have to pre-drill and countersink, so the screw is actually sitting below the surface. Right now you can see me drilling holes onto the sides of the jig where our position of the cylinder and the handle will be. So I'm using those holes to pretty much, when the jig is sitting on the door, drilling with a tiny drill bit through those holes onto the door, and that gives me an accurate position of where I need to drill later on with a bigger drill bit. It's a good idea also to write the size of the drill bit you're gonna need on the jig straight away. Makes it a bit easier if somebody else is using your jig or something like that. And yeah, you'll need a clamp for that. I found that the easiest way to do it without it moving or anything like that is with a clamp. And obviously you have to really line it up on the line that we marked before. Now you can see me clamping the sides onto the main plate, and yeah, as you can see, I countersunk the hole, so yeah, the screw is sitting below the surface. So after we've got both sides screwed on, we pretty much ready to go onto the door and cut our faceplate. After we mortised and cut out the actual mortise for the door, for the lock. Right, so over here I'm doing some final checks and final measurements, and time to test it on the door. So now we put it on the door. I made the jig for 40mm door, but as you see, that door is 38mm. So instead of making the jig for a 38mm door and then it will never fit on any other one, I made it for 40, and I'm using 1mm pecker on each side to sort of grab it tight onto the door. Now once we've done that and we line up our jig, we could use a clamp as well to actually clamp it up, so it doesn't move while you're routering, but that's optional, you don't have to do that. Now you can see me now marking inside the jig, marking the door. I'm doing it that just to double check that we're actually centered square and the jig works well and everything will be great. You don't want to plunge your router in there and then find out that you are 1 or 2mm off to one side and your whole lock is actually installed sideways. Yeah, so that's the lock we're gonna be installing. We're just obviously checking where to put it up, because we've got like this trim on the door. So just making sure that everything is gonna work and everything's gonna be in line, and we're not gonna run into any issues with installation. I really didn't wanna cut a bit of that door. So now you're seeing me with the router, with the same router bit with the wheel I showed you before. I'm just setting the depth. So to set the depth, you can plunge the router sort of through the side of the jig and and with the thickness of the faceplate itself, and set the depth for that. Don't worry if you didn't set the depth correctly. You can always pick it up from behind or cut a little bit more, but it's better to do it right from the start. All right, so I'll save you the boring part. I'm just cutting with the router with through the door with the jig. You can see some smoke coming out. It's because the router bit is pretty old, and the door is pretty hard. Now we're gonna be doing the holes on the side of the door as you've seen before, and after that we're gonna be drilling them out with bigger drill bit. Yeah, so after removing the jig, you really want to make sure, double check that everything's good, everything's in line, you have no issues, and um, everything done correctly. You can see me taking the jig out now, and just double checking, everything looks good, beautiful. Now, because the router cuts round only, you'd have to chisel the corners of the cutout. You could use a corner chisel like I do here. It's a special tool that pretty much with one hit cuts the whole corner straight away. But if you don't have one, you can also just use a chisel. Alright, so here you can see me using a mortar saw to cut out the actual cutout of the depth of the lock. Usually it's been done before the faceplate, but I don't know, we've just done it. Alright, so have a look at that. We put it in and it's perfect. I wish I had a close-up for you to show you, but it's literally so tight in there. So the next step, we're gonna have to check that we managed to line up the sides correctly too. That's the next step. And yes, perfect. Now those holes were already on the door before, but we had to add an extra couple for our new cylinder because it didn't line up on at the same spot. And from here on, you can see me doing the striker plate. Yeah, you don't have to keep watching, but it's up to you. Thanks for watching. Hope it helps, and I hope you find it useful. And again, you can use it for any lock. That specific one is a digital one, but you can use it for anything. I wouldn't recommend to do it for one off. If you have only one to install, it's not really worth the trouble, but if you're installing a lot of the same one, definitely worth it. Check it out. See you guys.